Hi everybody, it's Luke McBain, today with another book which I'm going to read from and connect what's in the book to leadership. Today, not a book by an artist or written by an artist or on an artist, strangely enough, because my hypothesis is leadership is the art of meaning creation. Today, it's this book. The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilChrist. It's a book on neuroscience. Sometimes a tough read, but super fascinating in the end, because it tells us a lot on how our brain actually works and perhaps also what to do to enhance it if you're interested to do so. But what, of course, I found extremely interesting is this connection, how the brain creates meaning and also art, of course. So I found it extremely interesting in terms of leadership. So because if leadership is meaning creation, then it's good to know how neuroscience actually backs that up and what goes on in the brain as we create meaning. So that's the objective for today. This is the thickness of the book. Of course, I can't read all of it, just some quotes. It doesn't do the book justice at all when I just read some quotes from it. So you're well advised to watch a video on YouTube on the Master and His Emissary. There's a couple of videos which really explain it well. Even short ones, even animated videos are out there, interviews with the author. And so it's probably a good idea just to delve a little bit into it. But as usual, this video is not about the book itself, but how it links to leadership. Again, Iain McGilChrist makes no such claims. Also, Tarkovsky made no such claims, or Boyce. But they made certain observations, and here it's the same thing, which is important to the subject at hand, and which we can use productively to advance the idea of leadership as a whole, and perhaps also explain why certain scientific observations haven't been that helpful to really advance the subject, but this is extremely helpful. So let's have a look. We'll start off with some very general concepts of the left and right hemisphere of the brain and what they do. So that's what he does throughout the book. He looks at both hemispheres and their distinct different functions and qualities. And from this also deducts how we perceive reality, how we shape the world, how do we come to a certain understanding of ourself and certain ideas, how we shape our lives and, of course, the lives of others. And so that's very interesting. And I'll just start off with a short introduction on some very basic concepts. Again, I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but just to sort of get a flavor of what's going on. In humans, just as in animals and birds, it turns out that each hemisphere attends to the world in a different way. And the ways are consistent. The right hemisphere underwrites breadth and flexibility of attention, where the left hemisphere brings to bear focused attention. This has the related consequence that the right hemisphere sees things whole and in their context, where the left hemisphere sees things abstracted from context and broken into parts, from which it then reconstructs a whole, something very different. And it also turns out that the capacities that help us as humans form bonds with others, empathy, emotional understanding, and so on, which involve a quite different kind of attention paid to the world, are largely right hemisphere functions. what strikes me just in this very short paragraph is this whole, leadership management duality. I mean, what he says has there at the ending. He says, it turns out that the capacity to help us as humans form bonds with others, empathy, emotional understanding, and so on, which involve a quite different kind of attention paid to the world, are largely right hemisphere functions. So even that, how to connect to people, is primarily a function of the right hemisphere. Think about that, just hold that thought when you think about leadership. However, he says about the left hemisphere, it sees things abstracted from context and broken into parts, from which it then reconstructs a whole. Abstracted from context and broken into parts, from which it then constructs a whole. That could be strategic planning. That could be management. That could be any management process by which you use some sort of level of abstraction, some sort of categorization, some sort of data, and you break everything into parts, and then you construct a whole from that. So some sort of direction, right? Some sort of scenario. So you have these two functions, right? And somehow they interact with each other. And there seems to be this similar duality in management and leadership, and we'll go into that a little bit more later on. And incidentally, also, in leadership literature and science, you have this problem that you're constantly abstracting leadership from its context and break it down into its parts to then have a model, which is then construct something whole. So that's an abstracted view on the subject of leadership, which we will see is primarily, which is constructed by the left hemisphere, but primarily a function of the right hemisphere. So we're trying to address something through a left hemisphere function, which is primarily a right hemisphere function. And that doesn't work. So the functions of the two sides of the brain are different. And he has this very good example, which really hit at home for me, of this bird which is sitting on the ground and pecking at something and trying to eat something, all right? So with one eye, it's looking at what it's pecking at, and the other eye is constantly watching the environment. And he says that's because the left hemisphere is focusing right on this single dot of pecking, very focused, right, to eat that seed or whatever it is, while the right hemisphere is scanning the environment for danger. So for something unknown, something which might come from the outside and pose a threat. And that was an excellent example of these two sides and what their difference is. But it goes even much further, and it has huge ramifications. So here he also talks about even the experience which we have as we live, and that the two sides of the brain give us a different experience. Hence, the brain has to attend to the world in two completely different ways. And in so doing brings two different worlds into being. In one, we experience the live, complex, embodied world of individual, always unique beings, forever in flux, a net of interdependencies, forming and reforming wholes, a world which we are deeply connected. That's the right hemisphere. In the left hemisphere, the other we experience our experience in a special way as a represented version of it, containing now static, separable, bounded, but essentially fragmented entities grouped into classes on which predictions can be based. This kind of attention isolates, fixes, and makes each thing explicit by bringing it under the spotlight of attention. In doing so, it renders things inert, mechanical, lifeless. But it also enables us for the first time to know and to consequently to learn and to make things. This gives us power. That's really, again, describes these two worlds. By the way, Persic in the Zen of motorcycle maintenance also describes these two worlds of the square and the hip, and basically that's on the level of neuroscience. So there's one world which is the world which we experience, right? Complex, embodied, very individual, always unique, and forever in flux. And this is also part of the problem of leadership literature and theory and training, that once the models are presented, they become lifeless, they become dead concepts. So many people would say, well, what's that got to do with me? My experience is unique in my function in leadership. So my situation, my problems, my psychology, the psychology of the people I deal with, the organizational culture, the process, everything is completely unique. So while I might recognize some categories, I might muse over them and say, well, that's sort of an interesting model, but since everything is constantly in flux from my subjective perspective, I have really difficulty adapting that model and making it useful. On the other hand, one is very well aware that these rational capabilities, so really to construct cause and effect, to set objectives, to attain them, to project certain developments, to engineer a building. All these things are of extreme value. And it says here, they give us power. So they give us power over the environment and sometimes also power over other people. So we have a huge kind of paradox here. On one hand, we would like to control everything, and we would like in leadership to get that answer to say, well, if I just do that, then everybody else will do this. So to have that mechanistic experience of some sort of rational, magic wand, right? So just if I could learn that, then I would be, this great leadership personality. But on the other hand, leadership is very much connected to that fluid experience. And there's more. He has here this section on the new versus the known. And I find it very interesting because part of what I work on is this observation that leadership is a function which transforms the unknown into the known, so which faces the unknown future and is in that transformation process. So that is the main function. It's not focusing on others and trying to somehow badger them into something. Well, that's just something which happens downstream. I mean, that's not why you're there. You're there to construct a future. That's why you're there. That's your main function. And how you communicate that and how you do that is then how you do that. So how do you communicate with people? How do you involve them, etc., etc. But if you have no mastery over the first, you for sure will have no mastery over the second. So to focus on the second to achieve the first seems crazy. So, but back to this transformation aspect of the unknown to the known, which also, by the way, creates meaning. So here's this section here on the new versus the known. It is the right hemisphere that is vigilant for whatever that exists out there. It alone can bring us something other than we already know. The left hemisphere deals with what it knows and therefore prioritizes the expected. Its processes are predictive. It positively prefers what it knows. This makes it more efficient in routine situations where things are predictable, but less efficient than the right, wherever the initial assumptions have to be revised. Or when there is a need to distinguish old information from new material that may be consistent with it. Because the left hemisphere is drawn by its expectations. The right hemisphere outperforms the left whenever predictions are difficult. Now let that sink in. It's exactly management and leadership. It's exactly the same. So you have some sort of routine processes. You have bureaucracy. You have guidelines. You have systems and structures in place to manage stuff. Okay? Those are left hemisphere functions. The left hemisphere positively prefers what it knows. But the right hemisphere outperforms it when prediction is difficult. So the more difficult the prediction is, the more difficult your environment is, the more chaotic it is, the more fluid it is, the more complex it is, the more you need to rely on your right hemisphere. That's rather simple, right? So what happens in the right hemisphere? Okay, for this, of course, you have to read the book. I would just grab one item here. I claim, for example, it's of extreme importance in leadership to practice metaphorical thinking and paradoxical thinking and duality on such. So let's say leadership education as a whole should see that as central elements, how to train people actually in metaphorical thinking, which means, by the way, as we will see now, this would activate the right hemisphere, which is there to deal with situations which are difficult to predict. So to make that more apparent why metaphor is so important, we will focus now on metaphor a little bit in 2 to 3 sections. So first of all, why metaphor is so important, why is it useful, and why you as somebody working in leadership should also focus on metaphorical thinking. Only the right hemisphere has the capacity to understand metaphor. Only the right. That might not sound too important. Like, it could be a nice thing if one were going to do a bit of literature criticism, right? Metaphor sounds like something from literature. But that is just a sign of the degree to which our world of discourse is dominated by left hemisphere habits of mind. Metaphoric thinking is fundamental to our understanding of the world, because it is the only way in which understanding can reach outside the system of signs to life itself. Outside the system of signs to life itself. It is what links language to life. Metaphors is that what links language to life. And this process, again, only in the right hemisphere. Incidentally, he also writes, the word metaphor implies something that carries you across an implied gap. Greek meta, across, therein, carry. And I claim that, for example, if we look at how we as individuals look into the future and we deploy certain tools how to do that in terms of planning and setting objectives and strategies and scenario planning and all that. So we have some tools by which we try to steer into the future, although it is inherently chaotic at a certain point and we can't quite predict it. It's very difficult to predict. But while the information comes in from the future, which we have certain indications what might happen there in the next couple of days or weeks ahead of us. So we start already to make sense of that. So you have to understand that that information comes in certain, like you have to imagine a certain kind of resolution. So the resolution is not very high. And at that moment, we use something to compare this information, these impulses, and we use metaphors to do that. Because we still don't know what it exactly is and what exactly it could mean. But the metaphor basically helps us to carry us across the gap into that unknown future. And if you work with metaphors, you will see how also people respond to them. They feel like drawn into the metaphor without knowing exactly where it will carry them, but it is somehow something which will carry them across a certain gap of uncertainty. So let's look a little bit more at metaphor. Metaphor embodies thought and places it in a living context. These three areas of difference between the hemispheres, metaphor, context, and the body, are all interpenetrated with one with another. Once again, it is the right hemisphere in its concern for the immediacy of experience that is more densely interconnected with and involved in the body, the ground of that experience. Where the right hemisphere can see that metaphor is the only way to preserve the link between language and the world it refers to, the left hemisphere sees it either as a lie or as a distracting ornament and connotation as a limitation. Since in the interests of certainty, the left hemisphere prefers single meanings. And why is that important to leadership? And why is that important to creating future or transforming the future to the present? So from the unknown to the known. Why is that important? First of all, he says metaphor embodies thought and places it into a living context. So he says language per se is already so abstract and removed from life that it has a very weak connection to experience, right? And of course we can see that in terms of any sort of rationalization happens through language, right? So, and what we can also see is that we try to even distance ourselves from our physical, emotional experience in the world through these rational processes. But metaphor actually is that which, connects it again, this thought, and embodies it and places into a context. So if you want to think of in terms of motivation, because this is always a subject, how are others motivated? Well, try using metaphors, for example. So there's an embodied thought. It has meaning. It can be experienced physically by those listening to that metaphor. I developed, by the way, something called a metaphorical rule book, by which I replace rules with metaphors. And you might want to have a look at that because it's quite mystifying in the sense that it places the person reading it and understanding it as rules into like a heightened awareness of motivation, of interest, a sense of exploration, etc., etc. So if you're interested in motivation, just use metaphors. There's another aspect here which I want to talk about just briefly. He talks here about embodiment, and it will come up later again. And the question of embodiment is very, very important also for leadership, literature, and science and research. Now, I've come to the conclusion that a lot of models, leadership models, and a lot of things which are taught about leadership completely disregard embodiment. Completely. Which is nuts, to be honest. It's very strange, and just let me give you one example. So the idea basically why that is happening is because leadership research and science is following social sciences and other sciences down that pathway of rational disembodied thought, where you need certain objective concepts, etc., which exist independently somehow of the human being and which can then be applied just like an engineering toolkit or a medical toolkit to do something and to predict the future. So this is the whole idea, right? However, leadership is done by humans, and especially by individuals. And one thing for sure is you need a body to do this, right? Because it is enacted, of course. And so this whole idea that you just read something on leadership and this tells you what to do and you put this as a script in your mind and start acting on it is ludicrous, because let's say, for example, the company has a set of values, and one of the values is we always treat our employees with respect. And then one of your managers reads that manual and says, okay, I have to treat them with respect, but I don't feel any respect. I don't know what that is, and I just feel superior, but I have to do that now because it's required. But in the actual belief is that this disembodied script somehow will work and make you pretend that you respect others, and they actually will believe this. Whereas we actually know from personal experience, nobody believes this. Like, you can discover immediately when somebody is lying, when he's not really embodying these values, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the body never lies. And we know by now that most of the communication is done through the body. So if you just put this as a mental construct in your mind, but don't believe in it, your body will immediately signal that you don't respect anybody, although you're constantly talking about that. Plus, there's another thing, your decisions. So decisions are actions, and they're embodied. And the your decisions actually signal all the time what values you represent. So the idea that leadership can be taught without the idea of embodiment is just as crazy as the idea that art can be taught without embodiment. Any artist would tell you, of course I have a body, and of course my body has a central role to play in my function as an artist. The idea that in leadership you could enact leadership without a body is just as ludicrous. So embodiment is central to leadership. Let's have another look at metaphor. There's another section I'd like to read on metaphor to drive that point really home. Metaphor is not just a reflection of what has been, however, but the means whereby the truly new, rather than just the novel, may come about. When a metaphor actually lives in the mind, it can generate new thoughts or understanding. It is cognitively real and active, not just a dead historical remnant of a once live metaphor, a cliché. So all understanding, whether of the world or even of ourselves, depends on choosing the right metaphor. The metaphor we choose governs what we see. Even in talking about understanding, we cannot escape metaphors. Grasping things, for example, won't get us as far as we would like, because the most important things in life refuse to be grasped in either sense. There you go. So the new, rather than just the novel, may come about through metaphor. And this is extremely, extremely important when dealing with complexity, chaos, the future, etc. Think about this for a moment. The metaphor we choose governs what we see. And so these metaphors, even if not consciously, even subconsciously, govern our behavior. So it might be a good idea, if you're involved in leadership in some way, coaching, training, theory development, to look at that more seriously, especially when it comes to this generation of new thoughts and understanding, which you have to constantly do in leadership. In another video, I will go into this whole idea of setting objectives and why setting objectives, or rather working with metaphors, will outperform setting of objectives, because the objectives are limited in what they can achieve. A metaphor is not limited in what it can achieve. An objective, you can only achieve what is in the objective. That's it. But what else, what other values you might be creating, what other futures are excluded from that process? The difficult bit about the stickiness of the left hemisphere is that once we have already decided what the world is going to reveal, we are unlikely to get beyond it. We are prisoners of expectations. New experience, as it is first present to the mind, engages the right hemisphere. And as the experience becomes familiar, it gets represented by the left hemisphere. There's two to three really important things in that short paragraph. One is, I just talked about objectives, right? The difficult bit about the stickiness of the left hemisphere is that once we have already decided what the world is going to reveal, we are unlikely to get beyond it. And that's the whole point of objective. So we have already decided this is where I need to go. This is how I will get there. And that's it. So the world will not reveal much else beyond those objectives. We are prisoners of expectation. And so what the left hemisphere does, it sort of compares that what it wishes to achieve to that which is the current situation. So it's this iterative process. But it is difficult in that process. You become a prisoner of what other potential aspects of the future might arise. And again, he goes into this aspect of first, the new engages the right hemisphere and is then represented in the left. So then we start talking about it using the left hemisphere. It is the rootedness of our thought and language in the body that we share with others, which means that despite the fact that all truth is relative, this in no way undermines the possibility of shared truth. It is the right hemisphere's primary consciousness coupled to the body's preconscious awareness of the world, which relates to our visceral and emotional experience to what we know about the world. He also quotes here Lakoff and Johnson. The mind is not merely embodied, but embodied in such a way that our conceptual systems draw largely upon the commonalities of our bodies and of the environments we live in. So if the right hemisphere's primary consciousness is coupled to the body's preconscious awareness of the world, again, that's pretty astounding, because that again means if, vital functions for understanding the world, especially the unknown, the new, are located in the right hemisphere and coupled again to the body, and all that is central for the question of leadership. There is no leadership without embodiment. And there is another important point here, which is that of values, which is shared truth. So this embodiment, this common experience which we have as human beings, enable us to have something like a shared truth, which is difficult as it is, because you could say, well, all truth is somehow subjective. Everybody has a totally subjective experience, which is true. However, there seem to be some commonalities. And one of these commonalities are values which are central to leadership. And values are based on the experience with the world, which is something which works for us as human beings somehow, so which are transferred by culture, by socialization, etc., etc. So values, embodiment, and leadership are all very, very much connected. You could even say values is something like a shared truth. So if you embody certain values, others might see them, perceive them emotionally as a shared truth. I mentioned the importance of the intention behind attention. As may have become clear from the last chapter, the nature of language in the left hemisphere and its relationship with grasp imply the overriding value to it of use, of utility. The left hemisphere is always engaged in a purpose. It always has an end in view and downgrades whatever has no instrumental purpose in sight. The right hemisphere, by contrast, has no designs on anything. It is vigilant for whatever is, without preconceptions, without a predefined purpose. The right hemisphere has a relationship of concern or care with whatever happens to be. So, the second part I wanted to mention is where the right hemisphere is conscious of the other, whatever it may be, the left hemisphere consciousness is of itself. Again, this is important. This addresses the issue of openness, right? Of the other, of the new. which of course for art is extremely important. So you have to put your mind consciously in a spot of not knowing to experience something new, which will present itself first in its metaphorical form and then is represented in language in the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is very much focusing on utility. And again, utility, of course, as we know from management, is extremely important. If you work as a manager in any position of responsibility, you always look at things in terms of the utility. How can this be of use? Is this information useful? Will it solve a problem for me? Will it help me to achieve my objectives? Will it help me to, I don't know, make more money? But if you only focus on the utility, you exclude yourself somehow from this ability to discover the new, which could yield much more value, which could solve many more problems. Because, as he stated, the left hemisphere only reproduces what it knows. It is mainly focusing on itself, on the reproduction of known approaches to known problems. That's where the left hemisphere is excellent in. So, to repeat certain knowledge, to repeat certain patterns, to apply them. And some people are excellent in this. They sort of like can use all these scripts to solve all sorts of problems, but they have difficulty then really venturing into unknown territory. James aligns the right hemisphere with the unconscious mind, and this link has been made by many others. The alignment has to be a matter of degree rather than all or nothing. As one writer puts it, the left side is involved with conscious response and the right with the unconscious mind. It is true that processing of pre-conscious information, which includes most of what is encompassed in social understanding, tends to be carried out by the right hemisphere. Pre-conscious information is processed primarily by the right hemisphere. So that means we don't necessarily have direct conscious access to how we think, how we produce solutions, how we produce knowledge. And to gain some sort of understanding of that subconscious or pre-conscious process appears to be something which could be of really, really huge importance when you think about leadership. Again, we already established that leadership's main function is to deal with the unknown, with a chaotic, fluid environment, to make meaning out of that environment, to be able to make decisions, to be able to communicate that in some way, in a metaphorical way. So to enable yourself or to actually be able to develop that skill, that talent, you would have to look at those pre-conscious processes of those subconscious processes and see how to enhance them. And you might say, what? How is that going to work? Pre-conscious processes? If I'm not conscious of my processes, how can I become conscious of them? Or you will say, what? Do I need a therapy? What's going on? Now, no. But that is exactly what, for example, art schools do. That's how artists learn their craft. They actually look more at these pre-conscious processes. They become aware of them and how to express them, because they express them directly. And there's a couple of tips and tricks how you could do that. One is, for example, dream analysis. The dreams are an expression of your subconscious. So if you have, and everybody has access to their dreams, so if you can write them down, if you can look at them, you are actually looking at a pre-conscious or subconscious process, and you could understand how your own pre-consciousness works in some way. So if you start working with your dreams, which I also recommend to, start doing a dream diary, then that is the road to go if you would start to enhance your leadership abilities, to start to enhance, to give that right hemisphere more space, more importance in your decision making and how you face the unknown. Similarly, I would say that the conscious left hemisphere thinks that it is in control, directing its gaze where it wants, bringing the world into being as it squints here and there, as it pleases, while the reality is that it is selecting from a broader world that has already been brought into being for it by the right hemisphere. And often it is not even doing that, since far more than it realizes, its choices have already been made for it. And also this is quite mind-boggling. So what he's saying that in our conscious abilities and our ability to rationalize, try to make sense of the world in a rational process, into categorizing the world into again dissecting the world into some sort of data points which we then analyze. We believe that we can make choices and make sense of the world, but he claims that even this process of directing its gaze, squinting here and there and looking at different kinds of data, that we believe this is some sort of free will, and that's how we construct then decisions. But he claims that has already brought into being for it by the right hemisphere, and often not even doing that, since far more than it realizes choices already have been made by the right hemisphere. So what we perceive to be important is fundamental for our decisions, how to deal with the world, with the future, with our existence, already is happening within the right hemisphere. And at the moment we rationalize about our decisions, most of our decisions already have been made, how to make that decision. So if you want to go back to the source, you have to basically go back to the right hemisphere, understand how that functions, and then through doing that, accessing basically a broader scope of capabilities of choices in front of you. I have another point here, which is about sculpting, and I'll read that. The left hemisphere in turn grasps, sees, receives only some of what the right hemisphere has received. Its method is selection abstraction, in a word, negation. But this selection, this narrowing, is once again not a diminution, but an increase. By restricting or selecting something new that was not there before it comes into being. The process is like a sculpture, in which a thing comes into being through something else being pared away. The paring away can reveal the thing that lives within the stone, but equally that thing, whatever it is, lives only in the stone, not in the paring away on its own. Thus the stone, in a sense, depends on the sculptor's hand, but not as badly as the sculptor's hand depends on the stone. The world that we experience is a product of both hemispheres, clearly, but not in the same way. The restrictive bringing into being of something by the left hemisphere depends still on its foundation in something that underwrites it in the right hemisphere. So again, the image which comes to mind in terms of sculpting, which is the term he uses, which also Beuys uses, right? Social sculpture, or in German soziale Plastik. And who uses that term as well? Tarkovsky, sculpting in time. So there seems to be something in that term of sculpting, which is fundamental of how we construct reality. So our impression is that we look into the world, or we look into the future, and dissect it through our rational viewpoint on it to make the best decision possible. But what he says, that's not actually what is happening. Actually, what is happening is that the world is being presented in its wholeness, first through the right hemisphere, and in its interconnectedness, in its whole complexity, in the form of a metaphor. And then with the left hemisphere, we start chipping away, we start parsing out parts of that information, we start making sense of it. And this process is what we see consciously as making rational decisions, saying this is the better decision than that, but actually we're just deselecting information to come to some sort of understanding of the world. And artists also describe that process as a sculpting process, as something which happens sort of like in this process of information selection as it streams towards you. And through that sculpting away, then the form, the decisions become manifest. So, to sum that up, you could see that as exactly, again, the interconnection of leadership and management. So, whereas leadership would be that facility by which you see the whole in a more symbolic, metaphorical representation, which is alive, which is embodied, which can be entered, which could be understood by others, which is non-definite, which has still multiple options available to it in this process of exploration. Management then starts to parse away information which it finds useful or doesn't find useful, but is basically a secondary process, or a process done mainly by the left hemisphere, which depends actually on the process of leadership. So I hope that the video was a little bit helpful. Again, a view from neuroscience on the left and the right hemisphere and what they do differently. Some insight into metaphorical thinking, where it is located, what is it being used for within the brain, why is it important for leadership, why there are difficulties in even understanding leadership, or let's say working with any sort of categorization and abstract understanding of it. The whole idea that leadership, of course, is embodied, and that any model which does not work with embodiment is an incomplete model of leadership, and probably also will not work. We had a short section on the subconscious, and that the right hemisphere is more connected to the subconscious than the left. Both are connected to the subconscious, of course, but in terms of embodiment and subconscious, that the right hemisphere is more connected. So the question, not necessarily of intuition, but again, all these aspects of discovering the unknown, the explorative process, leading through metaphors, are developed also when looking at the subconscious, at subconscious processes, which we know by now, sort of we have an idea how that could work. Artists do this all the time. They've been trained on that for years. So all the methodologies are actually there, all the didactics are actually there, which can be used for leadership development. So again, that was The Master and His Emissary. I really, really recommend reading that book. It's super important for leadership research and anybody who is into this subject. It explains a lot what we should be focusing on when talking about leadership, and perhaps also it explains why we are not, because then our left hemisphere just takes over and says, I know everything, this is how the world functions, this is the rational way of looking at things, just press this button and you will get super motivated people who just want to construct the future. Unfortunately, that's not the case. That's just another way of the left hemisphere trying to show how clever it is and overriding anyway the wisdom of the right hemisphere. That's why also it is called The Master and His Emissary. Of course, the right hemisphere is the master. The left is only an emissary which speaks on behalf of the right. And keep that in mind. Keep that in mind for your own development, for the development of your company, of whatever you're working on. So best of success for that, and see you in the next video.